Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Jewish Policy Center webinar series. I feel as if we've just been on a commercial break after our program Tuesday with Eli Lake. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director at the JPC and your host. Thank you for coming back on with us. We have a very large audience today. I am thrilled. I know you came on to hear our guest, Ellie Cohanim, but we hope you also keep sending those invitations out to your friends. For both of those reasons, I'm going to do a short form of our JPC commercial today. Jewish Policy Center is a 501c3 organization established in 1985 to provide perspectives on foreign and domestic policy by leading scholars, academics, and commentators. We support a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. We do, as you know, sit slightly to the right of center. And from there, we advocate for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, and free speech, as well as intellectual diversity. We're a little short on some of those these days, but that's what we advocate for. In this series of calls, we have been everywhere from China and Taiwan to Israel, to Russia and Ukraine, back to Israel, to Armenia and Azerbaijan, to Turkey, to the Gulf states, to NATO and defense spending, and to the Supreme Court, defense policy, and homeschooling. Today, we're going to concentrate on Iran, both internally and President Joe Biden's efforts to achieve a new agreement with the Islamic Republic. And there isn't a better person to lead us in this effort than today's guest. Ellie Cohanim is a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. She's also host of the weekly show Global Perspectives with Ellie Cohanim for the Jewish News Syndicate, and a politics and national security contributor to the Christian Broadcasting Network. In her spare time, she recently launched and serves as managing director of a new Muslim-Jewish relations NGO. Ellie previously served the State Department as U.S. Deputy Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. She was the department's first Iranian-born Envoy and led diplomatic initiatives that resulted in groundbreaking partnerships with the Arab world to combat anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and Islamophobia. You can see the results of that right now in the wake of the terrible terrorism wave in Israel. The number and the sincerity of the condolences from people in the Gulf and people in the Arab world about the terror to which Israel is subjected is striking. And I think it speaks of deepening human relations in a place where that is really very, very important. You don't want to see it happen for those reasons, but I found it comforting to see how many Arabs were willing to go public and say they sympathized with Israel. They sent condolences to Jews. It's new in my life. I don't know if it's new in your life. Ellie Cohanim, back to our speaker. Ellie can often be seen on Fox News, Newsmax, JBS, and CBN networks, as well as internationally on El Akhbariya, Iran International, and El Gad TV. She is a contributor to The Hill, to National Review, Newsweek, The Washington Examiner, and the New York Jewish Week. She had a life before her government service. She was senior vice president and special correspondent for the Jewish Broadcasting Service and an executive at Yeshiva University, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and UJA Federation of New York. She serves on the boards of the Iranian-American Jewish Federation of New York and the Latino Coalition for Israel. And she previously sat on the boards of AJC New York, the New York JCRC, and the Esther chapter of Hadassah. It's a hugely impressive resume, but my eye keeps returning to the fact that Ellie Cohanim arrived in the United States as a child refugee after she and her family fled increasing anti-Semitism in Iran during the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And on that note, I am pleased to say, Ellie Cohanim, the floor is yours.
Shoshana, thank you so much for that really kind and warm introduction. My deepest thanks for inviting me to join you today, Shoshana, and to my friend Matt Brooks, and And truly everything you just shared, I couldn't agree with you more. I will be talking a bit about the ties, the new warming ties between Israel and her Arab neighbors. And so, you know, we're having this conversation, I think, in a very difficult week for us. It's been an emotional roller coaster ride watching events in Israel. And I certainly will discuss that a bit. But thank you again, Shoshana, for that warm welcome. And it's really wonderful for me to be with Jewish Policy Center today. I'm going to launch into my remarks about Biden administration's upcoming Iran deal, which what I wanted to focus on was my expected outcomes of the Iran deal on the Middle East, North Africa region. I'm going to start with a summary of my expected outcomes, and then I'll drill down on each of those. So the first outcome that I am expecting is and probably the most significant, is the perception by all of America's historic allies in the MENA region that the United States is about to betray them with this deal, betray their basic security needs, and ultimately cause a fundamental realignment in the region. The second is a trend that we've been seeing now for some years, which is Israel's Gulf Arab neighbors depending on her to take the action necessary to defend all of them against the Iranian threat. This is a wonder to behold or imagine that little Israel, which only came into existence in 1948 and has been fighting this existential war for its survival ever since, would somehow become the protector of the region. But here we are, and this is part of the dynamic that we're seeing. Third is what Shoshana was referring to, and that's the continuing strengthening of the Sunni-Iran alliance, which we see being created with the Abraham Accords and have seen flourishing since the signing of the Accords. And as I mentioned, this week has been an emotional week. We witnessed for the first time in history Israel hosting the Negev summit. So on Israeli soil, we're seeing these foreign ministers of the Abraham Accords countries, as well as with Egypt and the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, all of this again on Israeli soil, history in the making. Fourth is the possibility of seeing Israel cornered into a potential strike against Iranian facilities. Fifth is the expectation of more terrorism and more terror proxy activity as Iran becomes more and more cash rich as a result of the Iran deal. Six is the likely possibility of setting off a nuclear arms race in the MENA region. And while there is more that I think we could discuss, but the last item in my list of predictions is the likelihood of stronger ties between the states in the region, including the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel, with the US nemesis and adversary, China. So as you can see from this list, what I'm predicting is what are going to be seismic shifts in the region, all as a result of the Iran deal. And in this list, I'm not even addressing all the things that could go wrong as a result of the deal, meaning the unexpected or unintended outcomes of this deal. One of which I've spoken on air and in every speaking engagement I get, which is the Iranian regime's presence on the doorstep of the United States in Latin America through their Hezbollah presence. And just imagining all that could go wrong with the Iran deal in 9 years from now, putting the Iranian regime on a legal pathway to nuclear weapons capability and understanding that they have this terror proxy presence at our doorstep. So I'm not even going to address that, but I wanted to just make mention of it. So returning to the beginning of my list, I want to start with the historic betrayal of the Biden administration of our traditional long-term allies in the region, most significantly Israel and Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I'm going to start with the Saudis first. The Biden administration came into office and they signaled an immediate distancing from the kingdom in three very distinct ways. The first was President Biden himself's refusal to engage directly with the Crown Prince MBS, even though we all understand that it is MBS that runs the country. He refused to have a direct line of communication with MBS and instead insisted on communication only with his father, King Salman. He did this on the premise of holding the Crown Prince accountable for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Now, obviously, everyone condemns the brutal killing of Khashoggi, but if it were human rights which motivated the Biden administration's foreign policy, certainly they would not be making this grand deal with the Iranians, who we know have a Khashoggi every single day. The Iranians have the highest execution rate in the world in 2021, and they have one of the most horrific human rights records in the world. So we know that, as much as there is a lot of nominal, almost virtue signaling on the Khashoggi deal, it cannot be that human rights is what's motivating all this. Then you've got the administration also releasing a formerly classified 2018 report again about the killing of Khashoggi. And finally, you have the Biden administration coming into office and lifting the foreign terror organization designation of the Houthis, which, again, all of these things immediately upon coming into office set about a distancing of the United States from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You combine this with the Vienna talks, in which the Biden administration came into office and they told us over and again that they would be negotiating a longer and stronger Iran deal. Instead, of course, over a year now since the Vienna talks began, all of the reporting that's coming out of the talks is telling us that it's going to be a shorter, weaker deal. And so while this might have been pleasing to the Biden administration's far left constituency, what we're finding is that since the beginning of Russia's war on Ukraine, the United States is suddenly finding itself in a bit of an energy crisis, because we're also no longer an energy independent country as we were under the Trump administration. And so when at this point, Joe Biden tries to reach out to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, you have the Crown Prince MBS refusing to take his call. And when Joe Biden has asked the Saudis to increase their oil production to offset the shortages that are expected as a result of the Russia war, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia refuses to increase their production. And so we're seeing the results of the Biden administration's distancing. In fact, there was an extensive profile, an interview done of the Crown Prince in The Atlantic just about a week and a half ago. And I want to read from that for you for just a moment. When the reporter asks the Crown Prince if perhaps he's misunderstood by Joe Biden, MBS response, I quote, "Simply, I do not care." And he goes on to say, quote, "It's up to him to think about the interests of America." We also saw this week a really important op-ed by the former English language editor of Al Arabiya English, the former editor, Mohammed Al-Yahya, wrote an op-ed in the Jerusalem Post. And in it, the headline is, "America is dismantling the pillars of its own empire." He writes, quote, "Sold disingenuously to the American public as an arms control agreement, the deal is an assault on the regional order that the US established in the aftermath of World War II. Explicitly hostile to Saudi Arabia, to say nothing of America's other greatest ally in the region, Israel, the deal replaces the former American-led regional security structure with a concert system in which Iran, backed by Russia and China, becomes America's new subcontractor, while America's former allies, the Gulf states and Israel, are demoted to second-tier status," unquote. I think that this piece very eloquently makes the point that I was making about the US betrayal of our historic allies. The second trend we've been observing is the fact that the miracle that little Israel is has somehow become, in its short lifetime, the protector of the region. And I predict that we can expect more of this. Israel has proven itself time and again to have this astonishing intelligence capabilities in terms of its reach into Iran and capability to disrupt Iran's march toward the bomb. So whether it was a daring Mossad operation into Iranian territory to withdraw Iran's nuclear archives, or the elimination of nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, or the multiple explosions at Iran's nuclear and other facilities, which everybody again attributes all of these to Israel, the Israelis have proven themselves capable of what no other country seems capable of doing. And so due to Israel's success with these operations, the Sunni Gulf states are now relying on Israel to contain Iran and protect all of them from the Iranian threat. This dependence on Israel will only continue to grow following the signing of the Iran deal, and naturally yields to my third expectation, which is the continued strengthening of the Sunni-Iran alliance. And although we do not see the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia formally joining the alliance as of yet, it's fair to say that the kingdom is tacitly, quietly, and informally very much part of this growing relationship, which again, this week we saw the Negev summit on Israeli soil, and we saw the strengthening of that relationship and history being made. Now, given that it seems that the region is depending on Israel for its overall protection, and given that the Iran deal seems to be proceeding apace, we have to ask ourselves, well, where does this leave Israel? What are the options that are left for the Israelis, as they have enunciated over and again that the Islamic Republic of Iran poses an existential threat to Israel, and that they do not see themselves bound to this new Biden-Iran deal? Well, certainly, I think everyone hopes that the Israelis can continue to successfully set back Iranian nuclear activity through their sabotage and other activities, which in theory can maintain a status quo between the countries and not yield an escalation. On the other hand, is it possible that the Israelis might find themselves cornered into a position in which they will have to conduct actual strikes on Iranian nuclear sites? From Israel's perspective, and from conversations I've had with their senior level security folks, historically, their expectation was that they would be responsible for maintaining the security around their borders and their perimeters. So that would mean containing Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now the Iranian military presence in Syria. Suddenly, they are finding themselves in a position where, and sorry, I should finish that thought. And so the expectation was that the United States would be responsible for containing a potential nuclear Iran. I think suddenly the Israelis are understanding that things are shifting. And what we saw right now with Senator Lindsey Graham in Israel this last week, give an interview to Jewish Insider, where he says that he thinks an Israeli attack on Iran was, quote, probably the only way to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. And he thinks that an Israeli strike on Iran is, quote, is probably the way this movie ends. Now, I don't think the Israelis see this as an ideal scenario, but like Senator Graham, I don't know that one can rule out this scenario either. The fifth prediction I shared is the expectation that as a result of the funds which will be released to the Islamic Republic, with estimates ranging from anywhere between 90 billion to 150 billion in frozen assets becoming available to the Iranians, as well as an additional approximately $50 billion in annual oil revenue, the Islamic Republic will be finding themselves flush with funds and very likely to increase their training, funding, and arming of their terror proxies throughout the MENA region. It's safe to expect a rise in Iranian terror proxy activity and increased destabilization in the region. My sixth prediction is the expectation that we will see a nuclear arms race in the region, with the Sunni states realizing that the Islamic Republic of Iran is on the pathway to achieving nuclear weapons state status. It's only logical for them to seek achieving the same status. And in fact, in March 2018, Crown Prince MBS said in a 60 Minutes interview, quote, Saudi Arabia does not want to acquire any nuclear bomb, but without a doubt, if Iran developed a nuclear bomb, we will follow suit as soon as possible. In August of 2020, we saw reports out of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times that US intelligence agencies are aware of China building an industrial capacity facility within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to produce nuclear fuel, which could later be enriched to weapons grade level. And I think it's safe to assume, again, that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will pursue a nuclear program as it understands that the Iran deal puts the Iranians on a legal pathway of pursuing their nuclear program in only 9 short years from now. And lastly, the final item I wanted to discuss is my expectation for China to fill the power vacuum that Joe Biden is leaving behind in the MENA region as a result of the Iran deal and other moves that he's made in the region. So much of what we hear out of Washington is that the United States wishes to disengage from the MENA region so they can focus its efforts on confronting China's bid for global domination. So in September 2021, we saw the Biden administration remove most of the US operated Patriot missile batteries from the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, and Kuwait. This removal of the Patriot batteries was, I would argue, another significant betrayal of our Sunni allies. Because these batteries were placed in 2019, following Iranian attacks on Saudi Arabia's chief oil producing facilities. And while the claim was made that it was the Houthis who committed that 2019 attack, experts since then believe that it was actually the Iranians. So at the same time that the US removed the Patriot missiles, they also froze American sales of missiles to the kingdom, making it almost impossible for the Saudis to protect themselves. So again, what can we expect as a result of these US moves? Well, I just mentioned China's construction of potential nuclear facilities in the kingdom. What's perhaps most troubling to me is recent reports that we've seen that Saudi Arabia is now considering receiving payment for their oil sales to China in the form of Chinese currency, the yuan. According to the Wall Street Journal, quote, the Saudi move could chip away at the supremacy of the US dollar in the international financial system, which Washington has relied on for decades to print treasury bills it uses to finance its budget deficit. So in essence, what we're seeing right now as a result of US policy towards Saudi Arabia and towards this movement in the Iran deal is that the Saudis are taking steps in retribution, if you want to call it, or in self-protection is another way to look at it, against the United States, going so far as considering using China's currency instead of the US dollar. And again, according to the Wall Street Journal, this could disrupt the America's dollar supremacy as the global currency in the world. I mean, the consequences of what the United States is doing with the Iran deal are just so monumental that I don't think enough attention is being paid to them. All of what I just addressed today. And I want to stay on China for just another minute, which is that this Chinese budding relationship is not exclusive to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They have these relationships all throughout the MENA region, including with Israel. So I want to talk a little bit about that. China's Shanghai International Port Group just finished in 2021 construction on a new port in Haifa, which it now is franchised to run for the next 25 years. In January, as part of the 30th anniversary of the establishment of China-Israel diplomatic relations, the 5th meeting of the China-Israel Joint Committee on Innovation Cooperation was convened, which is an initiative of Israel's foreign ministry to establish government-to-government ties with China, with 15 government offices and agencies within Israel and China. During the meeting, the two countries signed the China-Israel Innovation Cooperation Pact, which yields agreements in the fields of science, tech, healthcare, and so on. In 2015, China became host to the China-Israel Changzhou, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Innovation Park. It's a physical location within China for Israeli firms to get funds and collaborate with Chinese companies. By the end of 2021, the park had gathered 155 Israeli-owned and China-Israeli joint ventures and facilitated 40 China-Israel scientific and tech cooperation projects. In 2019, the China-Israel Innovation Hub in Shanghai was inaugurated with 70 companies operating there. And data showing bilateral trade in goods between China and Israel reaching $20.4 billion in the first 11 months of 2021, up 29% year over year. To my mind, the Biden administration is practically pushing our traditional US allies into the warm and open arms of the Chinese Communist Party. Again, Washington's entire argument for withdrawal from the MENA region is so that the US can focus its energies on confronting China's ambitions for global domination. Instead, as a result of the impending Iran deal and the long list of the Biden administration's decisions, from lack of enforcement of existing sanctions on Iran, lifting of the FTO designation on the Houthis, disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal, and most significantly, the impending Iran deal, what the Biden administration is effectively doing is creating a security crisis for our allies, which leaves them nowhere else to turn but to China. And therefore, what we find is that these Biden admin policies will ultimately facilitate China's global dominance rather than to stop them. And with that, Shoshana, I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you again for giving me this opportunity.
Ellie, we are thrilled to have you. We do have questions. Allow me to say on the issue of China-Israel, our magazine In Focus Quarterly will be out next week, and we have a terrific article exactly on that subject by journalist Maddie Friedman. So if you are interested in taking a peek at In Focus magazine, hit up our website. That's our commercial for In Focus. Yeah, question for you. A lot of people seem to be unaware of the fact that the United States is not in the room with Iran in Vienna, that messages were being carried to us by the Russians and from us back to the Iranians by the Russians. First of all, how viable is that as a negotiating position? Aren't we missing a lot, like winks and nods and elbow stuff and the atmospherics in negotiation? Secondly, what happens now? Because Russia has become, if not a bigger pariah than Iran, at least close to Iran in pariah status. Is it possible that this could sink the conversation or at least set back the conversation? And I'll be clear, I hope it does.
Shoshana, excellent questions. Yeah, the Russian role in all this and the structural flaws of the Vienna talks. So as the question states, and just to clarify, what we found at the very beginning of the Vienna talks was that the Iranians refused to sit face to face with the United States. Now, if the Biden administration had kind of any sense of dignity, understanding that we had all the leverage going into these talks, right? We were coming out of the maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration waged 4 years against the Iranians. They were left with about $4 billion in accessible foreign currency reserves, according to the IMF. This is, the United States had all the cards and all the negotiating power. And so what does the Biden administration do? They accept this. And they allow a structure of the Vienna talks where you've got the US not sitting at the table, but in fact, sitting at the table was Russia, was China, and the European powers. And the notion that America's adversaries, Russia and China, are somehow negotiating on our behalf with our third adversary, Iran, the whole thing is ludicrous, and it's a very important point and an important question to raise, and so in fact, yeah, the structure of the talks has been really an outrage to begin with. I'm sorry, and what we saw is that the Russian envoy held this interview a few weeks ago where he was crooning about what they were able to negotiate on behalf of Iran, and it exceeded, their greatest expectations of what the U.S. has conceded in these negotiations. Now, to continue on Russia's role, look, we're in a moment right now where we're seeing the United States and the world community indeed turning Russia into a pariah. But they have just, one loophole and one out in their pariah status. And that's here, again, going back to the Iran deal and their status as negotiators in the Iran deal. And in fact, a few weeks ago, they seem to be holding up progress because they made this demand that the Russians shouldn't be held, no sanctions should get in the way of Russia's ability to do business with Iran as part of the benefits of the Iran deal. And, for about 5 minutes, we saw the Biden administration talk tough, and then we heard reports that they had given in and conceded to the Russians on this. So what we've learned since then is that the Russians are going to be building nuclear facilities for Iran that's going to be giving them about $10 billion for doing so. And it certainly seems like the Russians are going to be evading these sanctions that the world community is at the same time levying on them. I mean, the whole thing is just ludicrous. Will Russia's role stop the Iran deal from going forward? Frankly, Shoshana, as much as all of us, I believe, on this call would like to see this deal not proceed, I don't think there's really anything that the Biden administration will allow to stop them from re-entering this disastrous deal. I just don't think there's anything that's going to stop them. And so, and I think the Iranians are fully aware of this.
So there was another question attached to that. Perhaps nothing will stop the deal, but is it possible that the idea of delisting the IRGC could be a setback for the Biden administration and the Iranians? After all, they are responsible directly, that we know of, for 608 American military deaths in Iraq, not to mention all the wreckage they've caused elsewhere. My understanding is the Biden people have slightly backed off of that possibility. Is that a potential win for us, win for the good guys?
Well, it's just that the bar has been set so low, Shoshana. The fact that there was even this consideration, this conversation being kicked around, and you saw Jen Psaki and others not outright reject the possibility that the Biden administration was considering lifting the FTO designation off the IRGC, which, as you mentioned, the IRGC has American blood on their hands. I think the bar has been set so low that this suddenly becomes, if the U.S. in fact doesn't lift the FTO designation, then this becomes something for us to cheer. And the reality is it's nothing here for us to cheer. But yes, I mean, I think that the Biden administration received a lot of pushback from members of Congress when it was first revealed that they're considering lifting the FTO designation. And even from Democrat members of Congress, I think it could really be something that is just too much for the American public to swallow. And of course, the Iranians are holding tight. Now, you have to understand from their perspective, from the Iranian perspective, dragging out the negotiations is only in their favor, because in the meantime, who knows what's going on over there? The IAEA certainly doesn't. They can't get access to nuclear sites. Nobody really knows exactly what the Iranians are up to in the meantime. So they don't, they're not, and I should say, and I kind of referenced this slightly, the United States has not been enforcing sanctions on China's purchase of Iranian oil. So since the Biden administration came into office, Iran has been accessed Chinese cash. And so they're not quite as vulnerable as they were when the Trump administration left office. And so it's completely in the Iranians' benefit to drag out these negotiations for as long as they can. What they see is that they're doing whatever they're doing. They've got the cash. And the longer they drag it out, the more concessions the Biden administration makes. So I'm not sure if this IRGC demand is going to torpedo the entire deal. And again, from the Iranian perspective, if it's just dragging things out further, it doesn't hurt them. And the reality is that the United States is even considering doing it.
Thank you, Ellie. This leads us to other questions. We have an optimistic listener who says, Secretary Blinken announced yesterday new sanctions on Iran. Is the administration now changing direction resuming increasing pressure on Tehran rather than pushing ahead with JCPOA 2.0?
I wish I could be as optimistic as the questioner. So the announcement that your audience member is referring to is Secretary Blinken announcement of sanctions against people in Iran who are tied to Iran's ballistic missile development. And so there's a few things to unpack there. First of all, he says in this Twitter statement that I saw that the ballistic missile activity is destabilizing. And so one of the key criticisms of the original 2015 JCPOA and the new one that the Biden administration is engaging in right now is the fact that it doesn't address Iran's ballistic missile development. And so, it's nice that they're placing these sanctions, but which would be much more effective was that the deal would deal with Iran's ballistic missile development and capability. I was on Fox News last week, and what I said then was, let's remember, what do you do with ballistic missiles? Well, you put nuclear warheads on them. There's no peaceful purpose to a ballistic missile, right? And so there's no reason for the Iranians to be developing their missiles as they have been. So I'm not quite as pleased. It's always good, but for me, it's not a good enough outcome from the United States. The other thing is that this announcement from Blinken comes on the heels of the Negev summit, in which he spent time with the Emirates foreign minister and our other, Arab foreign ministers who were there, and what we know the conversation would have been, and probably some of it was, had the United States kind of joined this summit, is these Arab countries and Israel were probably planning on addressing their expectation of what happens next with Iran, right? And the lack of the US strength in the region, and again, America's betrayal of them. So you have Anthony Blinken going in there, and he almost had to come out doing something in response to what I believe was a gathering of very unhappy US allies. And I think that this sanction announcement was kind of like a bone that they're throwing towards our allies.
That's interesting. I guess he had to say something to them. All right, let's turn the conversation then first to Congress and then to us. So the first question is it your impression that the Biden administration plans to submit any deal to the Senate for ratification as a treaty, number one? And if they do not, how do they expect to circumvent the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, passed in 2015, specifically requiring that any new agreement negotiated with Iran be submitted to Congress? And if they do, what is the likelihood that Congress will, the Senate will rise up and save the American people from this?
Great question. I just wrote an op-ed in Newsweek about INARA. So it seems like Congress has two ways of exerting influence and pressure on the Biden administration. One is to treat the Iran deal as a treaty, in which case it requires congressional approval, and the other is to treat it as an agreement, which INARA does. Now, the question that your listener posed is, how would the Biden administration get around these things? And well, what the Obama administration did was that they took the Iran deal to the United Nations. And that's how they bypassed Congress. So my expectation is that the Biden administration is going to follow the same playbook. And what I wrote about in my op-ed is that so far, what they've indicated as their kind of argument for why they don't need to submit the Iran deal to Congress under INARA is that it's not, they're arguing that it's not a new deal because it's a re-entry into the JCPOA. But what I wrote about in the piece is that, facts on the ground in Iran have changed. So even if you tell me clause for clause, word for word, it's exactly the same deal, the reality is not the same, right? And so it demands congressional review. And the reason why Congress passed INARA in the first place was because they understood the national security implications of any Iran deal. So I can't say for sure that Congress can hold the Biden administration accountable, but I think they certainly should. And there are these avenues for them to try.
But it's catch up ball. I mean, we are now behind the curve. So the next question is about us. Is this our fault? Was there some way to prevent the administration from going back into this kind of conversation? Was there a failure of planning on the part of Iran deal opponents, or is this just the course of events? I mean, what did we miss something somewhere? Because we are really far behind now.
Shoshana, Joe Biden, if I remember my facts correctly, when he was running in 2020, he wrote one op-ed, and he wrote about how he was going to re-enter the Iran deal. So everyone should Google it and find it. I don't think that they didn't tell us during the 2020 campaign what their intention was towards Iran and the Middle East. So I don't think anyone could be surprised by what the Biden administration is doing right now. And frankly, I find it, disingenuous when there are a lot of people who tell me that they're pro-Israel, at the same time, vote in certain ways, which are certainly not pro-Israel. So, again, I think they've been very crystal clear in what their intentions were. Is there more that can be done? Is it, is there no hope left? I had a call yesterday with a Christian group, and I told them, everybody should be picking up their phone and emailing and calling their members of Congress and expressing their disapproval of the Iran deal, demanding that members of Congress do try to enforce INARA, do try to enforce the Iran deal as a treaty. I think that the reality is that there's still hope right now that Congress could exert pressure. And even the administration understands that we're on the heels of the 2022 midterm elections. If the American people make enough noise about this and really kind of express how unpopular an Iran deal is, there is a possibility that we could see the administration at least try to take, potentially less evil decisions, like for example, not delisting the IRGC. There is, I think, still a moment. We have possibly a brief moment right now where we could still be influencing the administration and certainly members of Congress. And so I do encourage everyone. I don't think we should be complacent right now. I don't think it's quite too late. I do think that people should be, again, calling their electeds in Washington, call your members of the House, call your senators, email them. We all know that their staff log in every single phone call and every single email. And when they feel the pressure, they tend to act, but they need to hear from their constituents.
So that's a path for us to follow. One of our listeners' comments is unforced, enthusiastic, voluntary capitulation to our enemy an impeachable offense. Do not answer that question. Okay, it's out there, don't answer it. Larry, stop that. We do have a question, though, that relates to Iran's nefarious activities that are not necessarily nuclear related. There is some suggestion that Iran has been smuggling weapons or trying to smuggle weapons from Lebanon into Israel proper and stoking the kind of violence that you've been seeing come out this week, and that there's an Iranian hand back there. So a questioner says, can you comment on the explicit warning from IRGC Commander Salami yesterday against Israel and regional Sunni countries? It's just at the start of Ramadan and in the wake of this spate of terror attacks across Israel.
Yeah, I saw that threat. It's the usual, Iranian regime language about the Zionists and making kind of detrimental remarks about the Sunnis, that they're somehow like a cult and not the real Islam. And so they issued this threat against both Israel and the Sunni states. And, again, my understanding is that according to Islam, there is a requirement that you issue a threat before you take action. Look, the Iranians are designated for the past 10 years by both Democrat and Republican administrations as the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world. So they have an extensive track record of terror attacks and proxy terror activity. So, there's not, to my mind, there's nothing new under the sun. We can expect that they're going to increase, I believe, their terror activity. I think that the very fact that we're about to sign this Iran deal with them, the very fact that we're about to release funds to them, the very fact that Blinken was in Israel and he talked about settler violence instead of talking about holding the Palestinians accountable, all of these things greenlight violence, they greenlight terrorism. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see, unfortunately, more Iranian-backed terror against Israel and in the entire region.
I can't end on a negative note, so we need another question. Here's a question about Saudi Arabia. So one way that Saudi Arabia could go is to establish its own nuclear program. We know they have ties with Pakistan. We know that they certainly have the funds to do it if they want to. What is the possibility that Saudi Arabia could take a different approach, which is to say, try to find a modus vivendi with Iran in self-defense, find a way to reduce the Iranian threat for itself, regardless of what the Iranians do? Any possibility of the Saudis falling?
Well, there have been talks that have taken place between Saudi and Iranian representatives, which seem to be brokered by the United States, the Biden administration. There have been, these meetings have been taking place, but I think that on both sides, you can't change the fundamentals of either side in this. So you can't change the fundamentals of the Iranian regime. First of all, the fact that they're Shia. Second of all, that they believe that they have the right to regional hegemony, that they believe that they have the authentic Islam. You can't change that. And you can't change, on the other hand, Saudi Arabia being not only a Sunni country, but the holder of Islam, right? Saudi Arabia is where Mecca and Medina are. And so some of these things I just don't see changing. So, everybody, in the region, people are practical. And I could see that there were these practical attempts to possibly détente with Iran, but I just can't imagine that it's going to bear fruit. I don't see it. And none of the indicators are kind of indicating so that there could be some sort of a successful relationship between the Saudis and this radical revolutionary Islamic regime. So I think, Shoshana, to end on a more brighter note, I think for me, the brighter note is understanding that, again, while the Saudis are not formally in a relationship with Israel, they don't have diplomatic ties with Israel, nothing happens in the Gulf without Saudi blessing. And so we know the Emirati peace, the Bahraini peace with Israel had Saudi Arabia's blessing, and they're kind of right there in the background. And I think for me, the hopeful note is, again, this continued Sunni-Israeli alliance and seeing more of what you started with, Shoshana, the support for Israel from around the Arab world, and even support for Zionism. I'm seeing Arab voices proclaim that the Jews have a right to live in the ancestral Jewish homeland. And so this, to me, is the most hopeful note. It's the most hopeful sign of everything that I'm seeing. And I want to say, when I went to the United Arab Emirates on official travel when I was in the State Department, I saw coexistence there that just really was so inspirational to me. And this is at a time where what I said at a Shabbat synagogue invitation that I had to speak at this synagogue in Dubai was that a Jew with a yarmulke and a Magen David walking around the streets of Dubai and Abu Dhabi is safer than they are in the streets of France, London, and I could even add more recently New York and Los Angeles. So to me, I think there's this tremendous hopefulness and potential for a new Middle East. And that's really where I, again, get most of my inspiration, is seeing that potential for how this could evolve for the better.
So I love that. And I've always said, not always because it's relatively new, but the opening of the Bet Din of Arabia, the Jewish religious court of Arabia, is a sea change in the way the Gulf Arabs see Israel. And I don't think it was an accident that this meeting over the weekend was at Sde Boker. It's not a religious place. It's not a Jewish antique historical place. It is the foundational place of the building of the modern state of Israel. It's Ben Gurion's home. What could be more Zionist than that? And these guys went there and they seem to have an appreciation for where they were. And that is the note that I think we should, that is the positive note that I think we should end on. Ellie, this has been terrific. You are terrific. Thank you for enlightening us, depressing us a little bit, but leaving us also with a lot of things to think about as we go forward. Let me wish you in advance a happy and healthy Passover. And to our listeners, happy and healthy also. And we will be back again. Thank you.
Thanks, Shoshana. Thanks.